Something massive is breaking across the Middle East right now, and the language coming out of Washington should stop every thinking American cold. Iran has reportedly launched coordinated attacks across multiple theaters in the region. Not skirmishes, not proxy provocations. Direct action, or action directly attributable to Tehran, hitting multiple points simultaneously. And the United States has responded, not with diplomacy, not with caution, but with a promise of a decisive end. Now, when a nuclear-armed superpower uses the phrase decisive end about a nation of 90 million people sitting on one of the most strategically vital corridors on Earth, you are not watching foreign policy. You are watching the architecture of a much larger conflict being assembled in real time. The American people deserve to understand what that phrase actually means, historically, militarily, and geopolitically, because the media is not going to tell you. Power rarely announces itself honestly. It announces itself through language exactly like this. Let me start by giving you some historical context, because without it, none of what you're seeing right now makes any sense. Iran has been in the crosshairs of American foreign policy not for years, but for decades. And the reason isn't what you've been told. It isn't about nuclear weapons. It isn't about terrorism. And it certainly isn't about protecting American citizens. It goes much deeper than that, and it goes back much further than most people are willing to trace. When the United States helped orchestrate the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953, a democratically elected prime minister who had the audacity to suggest that Iranian oil should benefit Iranian people, it set in motion a relationship between Washington and Tehran that has never truly been about peace. It has always been about control. Mossadegh wasn't a radical. He wasn't a communist in any serious sense of the word. He was a nationalist, and that was enough to make him a threat. Because in the logic of empire, any nation that decides to control its own resources is automatically an enemy. That's the foundation. Everything you are watching today is built on that foundation. After the 1979 revolution removed the Shah, a man Washington had propped up for 26 years despite his brutal secret police, despite the torture, despite the systematic repression of his own people, Iran became something far more dangerous to the American imperial project than a hostile country. It became an example. A living, breathing demonstration that a nation in that region could say no to Washington and survive. And that example has to be destroyed, because if it isn't, other nations start to get ideas. So when you hear that Iran has launched attacks across the Middle East, you have to ask yourself the first honest question, which is, what exactly is the context in which these attacks are occurring? Because nothing happens in a vacuum, not in geopolitics, not in war, not anywhere. There is always a sequence of events, and the sequence almost never starts where the mainstream media tells you it starts. They always begin the clock at the moment that serves the narrative. They started the clock on October 7th and ignored the preceding decades of occupation, siege, and systematic dispossession in Gaza. They will do the same thing here. They will show you Iranian rockets and Iranian missiles and Iranian flagged actions across the region, and they will not show you what came before. They will not show you the assassinations. They will not show you the sanctions that have strangled the Iranian economy and pushed ordinary Iranian families into poverty for years. They will not show you the covert operations, the sabotage of civilian infrastructure, the killing of Iranian scientists on Iranian soil. All of that will be invisible, and what will be visible is Iran responding. And here is the thing about how empires manage public perception. They are extraordinarily skilled at engineering the conditions that produce a response, and then presenting only the response as the story. It's a technique as old as modern propaganda itself. You apply pressure, you tighten the noose, you assassinate, you sanction, you bomb proxies, you fund opposition movements, you destabilize, and then, when the targeted nation finally acts, when it finally pushes back with something visible and kinetic, you point to that action and say, see, this is why they're dangerous, this is why we must act decisively. Now let's talk about what decisive end actually means in the history of American foreign policy, because that phrase is doing enormous work and very few people are interrogating it. Think about the countries where the United States promised a decisive end. Think about Iraq in 2003. The decisive end they promised was the end of Saddam Hussein's regime, the end of weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist, the end of a threat that was manufactured in think tanks and laundered through compliant media organizations. What actually ended was a functioning state. What actually ended was the lives of somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million Iraqi civilians, depending on which methodological standard you apply. What actually ended was regional stability in a way that the Middle East has still not recovered from more than 2 decades later. Think about Libya in 2011. They promised a decisive end to Muammar Gaddafi's authoritarian rule. They promised liberation. They promised a democratic future for the Libyan people. What they actually delivered was a failed state, open slave markets, actual human beings sold in open-air markets in the 21st century, and a country that has been locked in civil war ever since. That is what a decisive end looks like when Washington promises it. Think about what decisive end meant in Afghanistan. 20 years of occupation, $2 trillion spent, and the Taliban ended up back in power the moment American troops left. The only things that decisively ended in Afghanistan were the lives of hundreds of thousands of people and the credibility of the proposition that American military force produces stable democratic outcomes. So when Washington now uses that same language about Iran, you should feel something shift inside you. You should feel a cold recognition because you've heard this before. You've heard the build-up, you've heard the justification, you've heard the promise of clean, decisive action that will make everyone safer. And you know how it ends because you've watched it end the same way multiple times in your lifetime. But Iran is not Iraq. And this is where the analysis has to become very precise, because the stakes here are categorically different from anything the United States has attempted militarily in the post-Cold War era. Iran has a population of approximately 90 million people. It has a professional military, a sophisticated missile arsenal, and decades of preparation for exactly this scenario. Iranian strategic planners have not been sitting still while Washington assassinated their generals and sanctioned their economy. They have been building redundant systems, underground facilities, asymmetric capabilities, and a network of regional relationships that means any conflict with Iran is not a conflict contained within Iranian borders. Iran has cultivated relationships with Hezbollah in Lebanon, with Houthi forces in Yemen, with various Iraqi militia factions, and with other actors across the region who share a common interest in resisting American and Israeli dominance. This is what Washington calls the axis of resistance, and they present it as a terror network, as a malign Iranian influence operation. But look at it from the other direction for a moment. Look at it from the perspective of nations and movements that have been on the receiving end of American military force, American sanctions, American-backed coups, and American-supplied weapons used against their civilian populations. From that perspective, what you see is not a terror network. What you see is a coalition of the targeted, countries and movements that understand they will be picked off one by one unless they develop a common framework of deterrence and mutual support. And that coalition is now activated, because what these reported attacks across the Middle East represent is not Iran going rogue, not Iran acting out of pure aggression, not Iran suddenly becoming the destabilizing force the narrative insists it is. What it represents is a deterrence architecture responding to pressure. When you squeeze something from every direction, it pushes back, and the pushing back, when it finally comes, is called aggression by the people doing the squeezing. Now here's what the American public needs to understand about the strategic calculation being made in Washington right now. There is a significant faction within the American foreign policy establishment, and this faction has been dominant for a very long time, that genuinely believes the United States can strike Iran's nuclear facilities, degrade its military capabilities, and manage the regional fallout in an acceptable time frame and at an acceptable cost. They believe this despite all available evidence to the contrary. They believed it about Iraq, they believed it about Libya, they believe it now. But there's something else at play here that is rarely discussed in public forums, and it is the role of Israel in shaping American decision-making on Iran. Because you cannot understand this conflict without understanding that the push for confrontation with Iran has been a consistent Israeli strategic priority for more than 20 years, and that Israel's influence over American foreign policy, through institutional relationships, through lobbying infrastructure, through shared intelligence frameworks, through the seamless movement of personnel between Israeli and American national security establishments, means that Israeli strategic priorities and American strategic priorities have become, in many respects, functionally identical. This is not a fringe observation. This is something that senior American officials, including those who have served at the highest levels of the CIA and the State Department, have said explicitly on the record in memoirs and interviews. And the merger of these two strategic visions is one of the most consequential and least publicly examined facts of contemporary American foreign policy. And so, when the United States promises a decisive end in the context of Iranian actions across the Middle East, you are watching the convergence of multiple agendas that have been building toward this confrontation for a very long time. You are watching the neoconservative dream of regional transformation, a dream that was articulated in documents like the Project for a New American Century, written in the late 1990s, which explicitly named Iran, Iraq, and other countries as targets for regime change. That dream was interrupted by reality in Iraq and Afghanistan, but it was never abandoned. It was never examined honestly, never subjected to the kind of institutional reckoning that would have been required to truly change course. The people who were wrong about Iraq were promoted. The analysts who told the truth were marginalized. And so the same logic, applied by many of the same people or their intellectual successors, is now being applied to Iran. Meanwhile, the broader global context has shifted dramatically in ways that the American foreign policy establishment seems either unwilling or unable to fully process. The world of 2025 is not the world of 2003. The unipolar moment that George H.W. Bush declared at the end of the Cold War and that his son tried to permanently entrench through military force is over. China has become the world's largest economy by purchasing power parity. Russia, despite everything, has not been economically destroyed by Western sanctions. In fact, the Russian economy has proven more resilient than Western economists predicted, and the attempt to use the dollar as a weapon against Moscow has accelerated the very de-dollarization process that Washington most fears. The Global South, a phrase that once felt academic, is now a genuine geopolitical bloc, making independent decisions about trade, security, and alignment in ways that would have been unimaginable 20 years ago. In this context, a major American military operation against Iran would not occur in a strategic vacuum. It would occur in a world where China and Russia have both made clear that Iranian stability is a priority. It would occur in a world where the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has expanded, where BRICS has grown, where alternative financial infrastructure is being built specifically to reduce exposure to American financial coercion. It would occur in a world where the legitimacy of American unilateral military action is no longer accepted by the majority of the world's population, even if it is accepted by the majority of Western governments. What that means practically is that any decisive American military action against Iran risks triggering a cascade of consequences that extend far beyond the Middle East. Oil prices would spike, and the global economy, already under significant stress, would be hit by a shock it is not well positioned to absorb. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply flows, is within Iranian capacity to disrupt, and any scenario in which Iran is fighting for its survival is a scenario in which that disruption becomes a serious possibility. The downstream effects on energy prices, inflation, and economic stability in the United States and Europe would be severe, and they would fall hardest not on the people making the decisions in Washington, but on ordinary American families already stretched thin by years of inflation and economic anxiety. And yet the language of decisive end is still being used. It's still being deployed as if the lessons of the last 20 years simply do not exist, as if the institutional memory of what happens when America goes to war in the Middle East has been systematically erased. Maybe it has, or maybe, and this is the more troubling possibility, the people using this language understand the consequences perfectly well and simply calculate that those consequences are acceptable given what they stand to gain. Because war is not only a military event, it is also an economic event, a political event, a restructuring of power and resources and attention. Wars create conditions. They create emergency authorities and suspended scrutiny. They create demand for weapon systems and defense contracts. They shift political conversations away from domestic failures and toward external threats. They rally populations around flags and leaders who might otherwise be held accountable for a great deal. So when you are trying to understand why the language of decisive end is being used despite everything history has shown us about what decisive ends actually produce, you have to be willing to ask the uncomfortable question: who benefits from a state of permanent crisis, and are those people the same people making the decisions? The American people are not the enemy of Iran. Iranian people are not the enemy of America. These are populations being positioned against each other by forces that have their own interests in this confrontation, forces that will not be the ones paying the cost when the missiles start flying, and the only thing that ever changes this dynamic, the only thing that has ever changed it throughout history, is when enough ordinary people decide that they are going to think for themselves, when they decide they are not going to accept the official narrative at face value, when they decide they are going to ask what came before, who benefits, what the history actually shows, and what the language being used is really designed to accomplish. That is not disloyalty. That is the most patriotic thing an American citizen can do.